Boldwood presents Falling for a French Dream, written by Jennifer Bohnet and read by Julia Franklin. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The letter landed on the doormat the first Saturday after New Year, sandwiched between the final telephone demand and the usual junk mail. Bending down to pick it all up, Nicola Jacques saw the French stamps on the envelope and frowned. She threw the junk mail in the bin, put the telephone bill on the kitchen table to deal with later, and thoughtfully studied the envelope. Written in Henri Jacques' distinctive handwriting, it was addressed to Madame Nicola Jacques, and not to Oliver, her son, and Henri's grandson, which was unusual. Her limited communications with the French family had always been between her, Aunt Odette, or Aunts Josephine, Henri's unmarried twin sisters. An unexpected letter from Henri himself could only mean one thing: bad news. Slowly, Nicola opened the envelope and took the letter out. Hadn't the world thrown enough trouble at her in recent years?
Cher Nicolas, tu will come to la pauvresse immédiatement. We have matters d'urgence to discuss. Mark's things to settle. Tu will bring Olivier. Regards, Henri.
The letter, with its clipped English sentences and ad hoc French words, conjured up an immediate picture of her ex-father-in-law. Old-fashioned almost to the point of eccentricity, she knew he'd never change his view of the way the world should be. He wrote English the same way as he spoke it, short and sharp, with no regard for grammar, and with little regard for other people's feelings either. Whatever lay behind this order to visit, Henri would have disregarded both her thoughts and Oliver's of being of no concern of his and of no consequence. He'd simply decided their presence was needed in France, so the command had been issued. Nicola placed a coffee pod in the machine, pressed the button, and stood gazing thoughtfully out of the kitchen window as the machine squirted coffee into the cup. What lay behind this unexpected demand? Was Henri feeling guilty about his treatment of her and Oliver over the past years? Did he want to make amends, somehow? Whatever it was, it made no difference. There was no way she was going to France simply because Henri commanded it. She and Oliver would go together one day, when Oliver was older, and could understand why things were the way they were. For now, she had to protect Oliver and lead her own life as best she could, albeit a different life to the one she'd known during the years when she'd been married to Marc Jacques, Henri's only son. "Morning, Mom." Oliver's voice jolted her out of her thoughts. Oliver rubbed the sleep from his eyes before moving across and kissing her on both cheeks. Before it had all gone wrong, Marc had always greeted her like that every morning, and as a small boy, Oliver had determinedly copied his daddy. These days, it was still a natural part of 13-year-old Oliver's morning routine, one that Nicola cherished and hoped would continue forever.
"Want some toast?"
Oliver asked, slotting 2 slices of bread into the machine. "Not right now, thanks."
"Who's the letter from?"
"Papa Henri." Nicola hesitated before pushing the letter across the table to him and waiting silently while he read it.
"Any idea why he wants us to go?"
Oliver asked, looking up at her. Nicola shook her head. "No."
"Are we going?"
"No, we're not. Papa Henri has no right to make a demand like that." Her words fell into a tense silence as Oliver looked at her.
"Actually, Mum,"
Oliver hesitated,
"I wouldn't mind going. Not because Papa Henri has demanded it, but—"
He gazed at Nicola sadly.
"Before he died, Dad was talking of taking me later this year when he was between jobs, and I'd like to see where he grew up. Maybe get to know Papa Henri a little bit better."
Nicola was silent, looking at Oliver in surprise. In the 13 years since Oliver had been born, because of the feud between father and son, they'd been to visit Mark's family just twice. Once, when Oliver was a new baby, to show him off to his French family, and again, just before his 5th birthday. Had Mark been beginning to perhaps regret the ongoing feud that had caused the estrangement from his family? If he had, he'd certainly not mentioned it to her. As for the possibility of taking Oliver to France to get to know his relatives, that again was something never talked about. "I didn't know Dad was planning to take you. He never mentioned it to me."
"I asked him if he'd take me, and he said maybe."
Nicola gave a wry smile. A maybe, to Oliver, meant that if he kept asking, he'd eventually get a yes to whatever it was he wanted. The toast popped up out of the toaster at that moment, and Oliver grabbed both slices and started to butter them, while Nicola watched him, lost in her thoughts. Had Mark been planning on taking Oliver to the family farm this year? She smothered a sigh. There was no way of knowing the answer to that question. Mark's tragic death 3 months ago had left both Oliver and her reeling. Perhaps a visit would be good. Allow Oliver to grieve and accept the loss of his father in the place where Mark had been born and spent his early life.
"Mom, are you okay? You were miles away."
"I'm fine. Just thinking." Nicola pinched a piece of toast from the plate. Playfully, Oliver smacked her hand before putting another 2 pieces of bread in the machine. "So, you'd like to visit Papa Henri?"
"Yep. Half-term in France would be cool."
Nicola looked at her son and sighed. "I know he's always remembered your birthday and sends you a present at Christmas. But don't expect him to be a storybook grandfather, will you? If he was, he wouldn't have shut your dad or you out of his life for so long. I have a feeling that there's more to this sudden demand to visit than a simple desire to be reconciled with us." She remembered the 2 occasions she'd travelled to France with Mark, hoping for a reconciliation between father and son, only to be disappointed. Whilst she understood Mark's need to live his life away from a domineering father, she'd always secretly hoped that time and absence from the family would have softened both men's attitude, and they would be reunited. Oliver shrugged.
"So what? It's only a visit. I know I probably won't be the grandson he wants. Besides, it's not just him, is it? There's the aunts as well."
Mention of the aunts made Nicola smile. They'd all had fun together on the couple of occasions they'd met, and both the women, on that first visit, had cuddled baby Oliver at every opportunity. "OK," she said. "I'll write and tell Papa Henri we can't come immédiatement, as he demands, but we will go to France at February half-term." A car horn tooted outside. "You live to football practices here," Nicola said. "You got everything?"
"Kit's in the hall."
Oliver grabbed a final piece of toast.
"See you later."
Nicola winced as the front door banged behind him. Crossing over to the machine, she made herself another coffee. Thankfully, she wasn't due back at the garden centre where she worked until next Monday. She needed time to assimilate this sudden, disturbing appearance of the past into their lives. Returning to France, spending time with Mark's family without him would, Nicola knew, feel strange. The aunts were sure to welcome Oliver and her with hugs and cries of delight. But Henri? Henri had always been polite, but reserved with her, behaving like a distant relative who didn't know her quite well enough to treat her with familiarity. How would he treat her now, that, technically at least, she was no longer a member of the Jacques family. Chapter 2. Wandering into the sitting room to sit and drink her coffee, Nicola paused by the small table with its table lamp and 3 silver-framed photos. One was a family photo of the 3 of them, taken a year ago, that had turned out to be the last Christmas with Mark. Another photograph was of Mark and Oliver in wetsuits, holding windsurfing boards, and both of them were smiling broadly. Taken at Easter last year, when Mark had signed the 2 of them up for a 3-day course. Nicola bit her lip as she looked at it. 9 months ago, nobody had any idea of the tragedy about to engulf them. The 3rd photograph was a windswept one of her and Mark taken by friends as they climbed a Dartmoor tor during the early days of their marriage. Mark was already living and working in the UK when they met. Nicola, who loved browsing in any charity shop she came across, had wandered into a local Oxfam in search of a summer skirt, not expecting to find her future husband among the bric-a-brac and second-hand goods. Audrey, the volunteer behind the till, recognised her as a regular and smiled her welcome as Nicola walked in, but didn't break off listening to the tall man at her side, who was patiently explaining some process of the shiny new till on the counter. Registering the man's attractive foreign accent as she walked past, Nicola guessed that, with his olive skin, he came from the Mediterranean area. France, or maybe Italy. Probably France, she decided, trying to listen discreetly. His accent, while lovely to listen to, didn't have that animated note to it that native Italians tended to have, whatever language they were speaking. 10 minutes later, when she approached the desk with not only a skirt but also a top, it was the man who stepped forward to serve her, glancing at the volunteer as he did.
"Audrey, she has something she'd like to say to you,"
he said, as he put Nicola's purchases in a bag and rang the money into the till. Nicola looked at Audrey, who was trying not to laugh. "Nicola, may I introduce you to Mark Jacques, the newly appointed facilitator for Oxfam in the West Country." "Pleased to meet you," Nicola said, wondering what was going on between the 2 of them. "So, what exactly is it you facilitate?"
"Basically, I look after all the branches in the West Country and make sure they are operating as efficiently as possible."
The shrug he gave was definitely a Gallic one.
"It means wearing a lot of different hats."
"He's very good at it all, too," Audrey said.
"I am about to take a short break for a coffee in the cafe across the road," Mark said. "And as we have now been formally introduced, I'm hoping you will join me."
A burst of laughter escaped from Nicola. "He's a very nice man," Audrey whispered. "Do go." "I'd love to," Nicola said. And that was how it all began. The one thing Nicola had difficulty coming to terms with was Mark's estrangement from his family. Her own parents had died when she was a teenager, leaving a huge gap in her life, and she couldn't understand Mark's continued acceptance of the family rift. When she mentioned sending a wedding invitation to Henri, Mark's reaction was a swift, "No, he won't come." It was only after Oliver's birth that Mark finally took her to meet his family. She'd realised early on in their relationship, though, that Mark was a man with boundless energy and a deep desire to help people and make a difference to their lives if he could. He was also a man who craved excitement and abhorred the dull day-to-day routine of ordinary life. He was always urging Nicola to be more spontaneous, wanting her to drop everything and join him. He'd suggest a day at the seaside, when they should both be working, or suddenly start to paint the kitchen sunshine yellow one evening without warning, because it was too dull. One amazing night, he persuaded her to join him skinny dipping at midnight at a secluded pond in a local park. The memory of that long-ago event would live on forever in Nicola's heart. The fact that Marc was one of the kindest people she'd ever met, was fun to be with, and she loved him more than she'd ever thought possible, made the early years of their marriage, when it was just the two of them, a delight. From time to time, though, Nicola would protest about the lack of routine in Marc's life. Her words, "It's routine that pays the bills," were always met with that Gallic shrug and a smile. But then Oliver was born, and Nicola's own hard-won spontaneity was buried by necessity under the responsibility of motherhood. Fatherhood changed Marc, too. Oh, he still railed against the boredom of a routine, but he was devoted to Oliver and helped look after him. As Oliver grew older and went to play school and then into reception for primary school, Nicola sensed that Marc was becoming increasingly disenchanted with the way his life had developed a routine. He'd escaped from what he regarded as a rut on the family farm in France, only to settle in England and become frustrated with the life he found himself living. Sitting there, she let her thoughts drift back to that last visit the three of them had made to La Prouveresse, the olive farm nestling in the hills behind Nice, that had been in Marc's family for generations. At the time of the visit, Nicola had hoped grievances would be put aside and that family visits would finally become a regular feature in their lives, that Marc would be reconciled with his father, their differences forgotten. But nothing had changed by the time their short holiday was over. If anything, things had worsened. As the aunts kissed them all goodbye, Henri had stayed firmly down in the vineyard, too busy apparently to stop and wish them bon voyage with his sisters. It wasn't until they were home that Nicola was told about the decision Marc had made, and realised why. It was a decision that changed the course of his life again, all their lives, and put the final seal on the rift with his father. She'd been totally unprepared for the bombshell he dropped after they arrived home from that last visit to France 8 years ago. They'd arrived home tired after a day travelling, and Nicola had quickly sorted some food for them all and organised bedtime for Oliver. After reading him a bedtime story and tucking him up in bed, she went downstairs, hoping that Marc had opened one of the bottles of red wine they'd brought home with them, and looking forward to spending a quiet evening together. Marc was sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the post that had arrived while they were away, a glass of wine already in front of him, one waiting for Nicola.
"I need to tell you something,"
Marc said as he handed her the glass.
"You'd better sit down."
Something in the tone of his voice alerted her to the fact that this something was serious. She sat, took a sip of her wine, and waited.
"I've applied for and been accepted as an organizer for another charity."
He held up his hand as Nicola smiled and went to speak.
"Wait. It's a position with Médecins Sans Frontières, which means I can expect to be sent anywhere there is a humanitarian need at a moment's notice to organize the relief aid needed on the ground. My contract starts on the 1st of next month."
"It sounds like the kind of thing you've always wanted to do," Nicola said slowly, desperately trying to get her head around this bombshell and wondering where she and Oliver fitted into it. A real hands-on, important job. But the 1st is only a few days away. What about working your notice at Oxfam?
"I've been working my notice out for the last month,"
Marc said quietly.
"They've been very supportive. The holiday in France was time I was due, and I'm no longer an employee."
Nicola stared at him as her anger started to rise. "Marc, you're way out of order with this. Why the hell didn't you discuss these plans with me before? Surely it's a decision we should have made together."
"Because I didn't want you to try to stop me. Selfish, I know, but this is something I need to do for me. I know your life will change when I'm not around all the time."
Mark looked at her steadily, his eyes sad.
"But it won't necessarily be all bad. I'll be home on leave every few months."
Is this why Henri didn't come and say goodbye properly? You told him what you were doing, and once again he didn't approve? Something she had in common with Henri, then?
"He reacted as I expected him to,"
Mark said, shrugging. What about Oliver? You're going to miss so much of him growing up. How do I tell him you're not here for weeks on end?
"You tell him the truth, that Daddy has gone to help some other less fortunate people and little children."
And me? How am I expected to cope with you being away? Mark knew how much she missed him when he was away, even for a few days. But here he was, expecting her to cope for weeks, months on end.
"You're a strong woman, Nicola. I know you'll cope."
You're not giving me any choice. Nicola remembered rubbing her face with a trembling hand before pushing her chair back and standing up. I do understand what's driving you to do this, but I wish with all my heart that you discuss this with me before simply going ahead, she'd said, turning and leaving the kitchen before Mark could see the tears that were beginning to course down her cheeks. She hadn't known it at the time, but Mark's decision to join Médecins Sans Frontières was the beginning of the crack in their marriage that would widen and widen until everything fell apart. Chapter 3. Taking a sip of her now almost cold coffee, Nicola thought about those first months after Mark had left to start his new life away from them, 8 years ago. A young Oliver had coped well with the new dynamic of their lives. After a nightly bedtime, "I wish Daddy was here," for a few weeks, he'd settled down into their new routine. Nicola had tried to make everyday life as normal as possible for Oliver, as she struggled to adapt to coping with the strangeness of being alone. Together, they looked forward to the times when Mark came home on leave, and they were a family again. Nicola did grow accustomed to her strange lifestyle. A single mum for several months, and then Mark would return home and become the head of the family again. For a few weeks. The next devastating shock came a year or two later. Mark, arriving home for a few weeks, elected to sleep in the spare bedroom and told Nicola he wanted a divorce. In vain, Nicola had protested, "I don't want a divorce. Why can't we just let things stay as they are? OK, it's not ideal, but it's worked for us since you joined Médecins Sans Frontières." Mark had shaken his head sadly.
"Nicola, you are a great mother to Oliver, and I know you would like more children, but I'm no use as a father or a husband, living the way I do. It isn't fair on either of you. I love you, so it is better I let you go. Let you be free to meet someone else."
Nicola had stared at him in disbelief. She'd thought they were happy. Their lifestyle was a little strange, but it worked. She still loved Mark, but now he was telling her that because he loved her, he wanted a divorce. Nicola couldn't see the logic in his argument at all, but Mark was adamant, and the divorce went ahead. Afterwards, Nicola struggled sometimes to remember they weren't still married. Outwardly, everything carried on as it had before. Mark continued to work wherever in the world he was needed, and at home she and Oliver got on with their daily lives. Oliver at school, Nicola at the garden centre. Whenever Mark was in the UK, he stayed with them, using the spare room as his base, so he could spend the time with Oliver. It took Nicola a long time to recover from the hurt and the pain of the divorce. She didn't, as Mark had hoped, meet someone new and remarry. Her main concern was giving Oliver as stable a family life as she could manage under the circumstances. When Oliver was older, more independent. Perhaps then she'd give some thought to her own feelings. It was hard to believe, now, that so many years had passed whilst they'd lived that kind of separate yet together existence, since Mark had changed the pattern of their lives. How long it would have continued in the same manner if 3 months ago the accident hadn't happened, Nicola had no way of knowing. Mark had been in Umbria, Italy, for just 36 hours, helping rescuers in the aftermath of the 6.6 magnitude earthquake that had destroyed villages and killed hundreds of people. The colleague who broke the awful news to her said that Mark had died a hero, pulling a small child out of a partially collapsed house. He'd barely handed the child over when there was a loud crack and a rumble, and before he could move, the rest of the house started to give way, a large stone falling and hitting Mark unconscious, before the rest of the building buried him in debris. He died before they could get him out. Sighing, Nicola stood up, took her coffee cup into the kitchen, and began to clear the breakfast things away. Mark's absence from everyday involvement in her life for so long had certainly cushioned the initial impact of his death for her. But she still felt bereft and sad for Oliver's loss. It hadn't helped that, as Mark was a French citizen, and because of the divorce, she was no longer shown as next of kin. His body had been flown back to France for Henri to deal with. When Nicola had telephoned the farm to ask about the funeral arrangements, so she could book flights for herself and Oliver, a tearful Odette had answered. Within 24 hours of Mark's body arriving back on French soil, he'd been cremated. Henri's decision, Odette had said. He wanted it all dealt with tout de suite. Claimed it made no sense to extend the misery. Nicola remembered sighing at Odette's words. So, neither she nor Oliver had been given the chance to say that final, important goodbye. As she stood there, deep in her thoughts, she noticed that the sunlight pouring in through the window was highlighting the dust particles floating in the air above the cooker. The place could do with decorating, she realised. The paintwork was faded, the kitchen units old-fashioned. The large map of the world that Mark had pinned on the back of the larder door before his very first contract in Japan, so that Oliver could see which part of the world he was in, was curling around the edges, still with numerous pins dotted over its surface. In the beginning, Nicola had hated looking at it, but Oliver had asked her to leave it. I still like to look at it, see all the places where Dad had been helping people. Besides, the kitchen wouldn't be the same without it, he'd said. Nicola sighed. For the last few years, the need to keep the kitchen, the house itself, updated, had been the least of her worries. Now she had another worry. What exactly lay behind Henri's invitation to visit? Only one way to find out. She'd phone the farm and ask the aunts before she wrote to Henri. Her fingers were crossed as she listened to the ringing tone. Hopefully, Henri would be busy outside with farm work. To Nicola's relief, it was Aunts Josephine who answered the phone and was thrilled to hear from her. After the usual pleasantries, Nicola took a deep breath. Henri's written to me, demanding I bring Oliver over immediately. Do you know why? Trust my brother not to tell you the reason he wants you both here. There was a short pause. Henri, he feels it's time to scatter Mark's ashes on the farm. Odette and I tell him you and Oliver should be here. He is Mark's son, after all, and you were Mark's wife. Nicola was silent. She hadn't anticipated that. There was no way she could refuse to go and turn down the unexpected opportunity of saying a final goodbye to Mark. Oliver especially needed closure.
Will you come? Josephine asked quietly.
Yes, but I can't come until the February half-term because of school and work commitments. Henri probably wants it to happen before then.
Half-term week it is, Josephine said. I will tell Henri that it is arranged. He will have to wait.
Pressing the disconnect button, Nicola couldn't help wondering how Henri would react to his plans being put on hold. One thing was certain. He was sure to blame her for the delay. Chapter 4. Josephine Jacques smoothed the quilt over the freshly made-up bed. She'd used the best linen for Nicola. Linen that she'd washed and dried the old-fashioned way, across a bed of wild herbs, before folding it carefully and placing it in the old armoire. Now, as the smell of lavender and rosemary wafted through the room, she could scarcely believe this longed-for visit was about to happen. Glancing out through the small window set high in the eaves, Josephine could see Henri walking slowly along the old olive grove terrace at the back of the farm. 20 hectares of olive trees to the south of the house now grew La Prouveresse's commercial crop. But Henri maintained that this small terrace, planted by their great-great-grandfather, still bore the best olives. Only oil from those particular olives was ever used in their kitchen. Josephine watched her brother for a few moments. He'd visibly aged in the last year. The shock and grief of losing Marc had hit them all hard. But it had hit Henri the hardest. Yet at 66, there was still something lingering in the set of his shoulders, the way he walked, that reminded her of the large-hearted boy he'd been when they were all growing up. He'd been a great practical joker and had delighted in catching out his younger twin sisters, but never in a malicious way. He was always the first to shoulder the responsibility when things went wrong and protect his sisters. She remembered, too, how ambitious Henri had been in those far-off days. Henri Jacques was going to be someone and something when he grew up. The most famous saxophone player in the world was top of the list. But when his father insisted that, as the only son, it was his duty to take over the farm and look after his sisters, Henri had to give up all his dreams of pursuing a life away from the farm. Years later, he'd never understood or come to terms with his own son's refusal to even contemplate a life on the farm. Josephine remembered the family rows as Marc grew older, and Henri expected him to take on some of the responsibility.
The farm is your birthright. I ought to stay. What's so different for you? I am sorry, but it is not the life I want. You of all people should understand that.
In vain, Henri had told him,
only lucky people or fools get to live the life they want. The rest of us compromise.
Bernadette, Marc's mother, had been the peacemaker between them, telling Henri he couldn't keep Marc a prisoner. That things had altered during the last century, changing the world in the 21st century into a different place, with more opportunities for those who wanted to see the world. Once he'd seen some of it, Marc might well be back. Reluctantly, Henri had finally agreed to Marc spending a year travelling, on the condition that when the 12 months were up, he would return to work on the farm. When Bernadette died shortly after Marc's 19th birthday, and he returned for her funeral, Henri insisted that Marc stayed. Within 6 months, Marc had said he couldn't take any more. The strict boundaries of his life were smothering him. The last bitter row escalated into a slanging match, with Henri finally shouting, "If you don't stay and do your duty, I'll cut you off." Marc had sighed.
Papa, I'm truly sorry, and that is your decision to make, which I must respect, as you must respect mine. I can't stay."
The next day, he'd gone. It had been 10 years before he returned, bringing Nicola and baby Oliver to La Prouveresse to meet them all for the first time. A short holiday that had soothed some of the old hurts away, but failed to heal the rift. Josephine knew that for over 20 years, Henri had been living with the hope that Marc would one day regret leaving the farm and return for good. Then, a catastrophe in a foreign country had finally killed Henri's dream. Watching as Henri reached the end of the olive terrace and half jumped, half slithered down the jutting-out rocks that served as steps back to level ground, Josephine prayed Nicola and Oliver's visit would be the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives, a time when she, Odette, and hopefully Henri could put the past behind them and create a proper family bond between the five of them. Making a mental note to place a fresh vase of flowers on the dressing table the day Nicola and Oliver arrived, she closed the bedroom shutters before she hurried downstairs to make Henri's morning coffee. "Ça va?" she asked automatically as he opened the kitchen door.
"Oui,"
Henri answered, wiping the mud off his boots on the old olive oil filter that served as a back doormat. Josephine poured his coffee before saying, "Just think, one more day, and Nicola and Oliver will be here. I find it hard to believe they are coming." Henri looked at her, irritated.
"Taken them long enough. Can't for the life of me see why they didn't come when they got my letter."
Josephine gave an exasperated sigh.
"Why do you always have to be so belligerent, Henri? You know why they couldn't come before. Nicola works and Oliver has school. It had to be this half-term. Besides, you should think yourself lucky they're coming at all. I wish it wasn't for this sad reason it is, but..."
Josephine shrugged.
"Personally, I wouldn't have been surprised if Nicola had refused. She must be wondering what sort of reception she's likely to get after all this time."
Henri shrugged his shoulders, but didn't answer his sister.
"Please, for all our sakes, be gentle with Nicola and Oliver when they get here. They have both been through so much and have always stood by Marc and his pursuit of happiness."
Josephine paused.
"I've made up the bed in Marc's old room for Oliver, and before you say anything, it's about time that room was used again."
Henri looked at Josephine, his face expressionless, as she continued,
"When Nicola and Oliver leave, I'm thinking of turning it into a sewing room."
"We'll see about that," Henri said, and he opened his Nice Matin newspaper to the sports page, effectively shutting out his sister and daring her to disturb him. Josephine sighed and fetched her workbox from the dresser. 10 minutes with a crochet hook as she drank her coffee would serve to calm her down. They both glanced up as Odette opened the kitchen door, Josephine with a smile of welcome on her face for her sister, and Henri in irritation as the draft rustled his paper.
"Busy down in the market this morning?"
Josephine asked, getting up to pour her sister a coffee.
"Normal crowd, although there were a few strangers, early tourists, I think."
Odette glanced in Henri's direction as she started to put the shopping away.
"Sylvie says you haven't forgotten you're taking her out tonight, have you?" "No,"
Henri answered irritably as he stood up.
"Although why I need another woman buzzing me around when I've got you two is beyond me. I'm off to the barn to check the sheep."
And the door banged behind him. Josephine and Odette looked at each other and smiled. They both agreed years ago that their friend Sylvie Troye, widow, mother and grandmother, was good for Henri. It was to Sylvie that Henri had turned when the news about Marc had arrived. The twins had done their best to comfort him, but it had been Sylvie who'd stopped him drowning his sorrows in pastis every evening. Sylvie had joined with them too in persuading Henri to write and invite Nicola and Oliver to come for the scattering of Marc's ashes, even if he had failed to mention what was behind the invitation. Family unity was important to Sylvie, and she'd always told Henri he was wrong not to accept Marc's decision to live a different life.
"Sylvie have anything else to say?" Josephine asked. "Raoul's in trouble with the villagers. You know, the land below us he inherited from his father's brother, Dominique, last year? Well, he's decided he wants to sell it, and the village is up in arms about it, accusing him of selling his heritage and giving newcomers and foreigners the opportunity to buy their inheritance. One or two are even moaning about the fact that they can't get their vegetables there anymore."
Josephine laughed.
"Nobody bought any stuff from there regularly once the supermarché was built, 5, 6 years ago?"
Once, the small holding had been a thriving pépinière, the main source of plants, vegetables and fruit for the village. But now, its land lay overgrown and neglected. The small cottage, empty for over a year, was in urgent need of some loving care and attention.
"I know," Odette agreed. "Raoul's been looking for a tenant, but nobody wants to take it on. 8 hectares is too big for most people to garden, but it's not really big enough for commercial purposes. He says he's got no option but to sell. Besides, he needs the money for something else."
"Any idea what?" Josephine asked, curiously.
Odette shook her head. "Hasn't even told his mother. Some investment he wants to make is all he's told Sylvie. He's asked her to mention the pépinière to Henri. Although why he should think Henri needs any more land is beyond me. Enough work up here for the 3 of us, without taking on more hectares half a kilometre down the road."
"True,"
Josephine said. "There used to be a couple of good olive trees on that land, though, and some citrus. Vines, too, if I remember. Shame if it's all grubbed up and built on."
Odette glanced at her.
"Sounds as if you'd like to save it."
Josephine shook her head.
"Too late for me to take on something like that." She paused. "But I do wonder sometimes if Henri and Sylvie were ever to get married, where you and I would go."
Chapter 5. Nicola folded Oliver's freshly ironed favourite T-shirt, unplugged the iron, and carried the pile of ironing upstairs to finish packing for their holiday. Refusing to use a suitcase, Oliver had dragged one of Marc's old rucksacks out of the attic, and its pockets and pouches were already filled with the essentials of Oliver's life. His iPod, a travel game, the baseball cap Marc had brought him back from Mexico after one of his missions, and his camera. One of the smaller pockets held a notebook, and Nicola could see the edge of a black and white photo sticking out between its pages. Nicola knew without looking. It was the photo of Marc that had been on Oliver's bedside table for the last few months. When, after her phone call with Josephine, she'd gently told Oliver the reason behind Henri's invitation to La Prouveresse, and confirmed they were going at half-term, she'd seen the way he struggled to hold back the tears. He hadn't protested when she'd taken him in her arms. "It won't be an easy occasion for either of us," she'd said, "but we'll get through it. We'll also try to make some happier memories for you to bring back while we're there as well." Oliver had sniffed.
"I wish Dad hadn't died. I miss him so much. Going to France without him seems wrong."
Nicola, fighting back her own tears, had given him a tight hug before murmuring, "I know. I know." Now, as she placed Oliver's clean T-shirts on the bed, she prayed that their visit to Mark's family home wouldn't be too traumatic an experience for his son. Nicola heard the front door slam and called out, "I'm upstairs, in your room."
"What's for tea?"
Oliver demanded, as he threw his school bag and then himself onto the bed.
"I'm starving."
"Nothing new there, then?" Nicola teased. "Andrew's coming for supper, so I'm making spaghetti bolognese."
"That'll be ages," Oliver moaned. "Can I make a cheese sandwich now?"
"Finish your packing while I go downstairs and make you one." An hour later, as she zipped her own suitcase closed and checked the buckles on Oliver's rucksack were tight enough, Andrew arrived. Originally Mark's friend, he'd become more and more entwined in their lives as the years went by, so much so that Nicola knew Oliver regarded him more like a big brother rather than as a friend of his father. Mark had often teased Andrew about finding himself a wife and settling down, but Andrew had simply shrugged, saying he was happy as he was. With Mark away for months at a time, he had quietly become an indispensable part of Nicola's support system, never hesitating when she asked for help, especially in those early days after Mark's death, when she'd barely been able to function. Recently, though, she'd sensed a subtle difference in him. Something in his gaze when he looked at her made her suspect that his feelings towards her were changing, that he was beginning to think of her as more than a friend, which was something she knew she could never be. He was a kind, good-looking man, and she was fond of him as a friend, but that was all he would ever be to her, a friend. She simply didn't see him in any other way. Her suspicions had been aroused when the half-term visit to France had first been mooted, and Andrew had wanted to go with them.
"For moral support," he'd said. "I don't like to think of you facing Henri alone. Mark told me how controlling he was."
Gently, Nicola had dissuaded him. Going to France this first time with just Oliver was something she had to do alone. The thought of turning up there with another man in tow was a complication she didn't need. She was grateful when Andrew had insisted instead that he'd move in while they were away to keep an eye on the place and to look after Frisbee, the cat. When she returned from this holiday in France, she would have to carefully explain and make sure that Andrew understood she would only ever like him as a friend, nothing more. While Nicola finished organising supper, Andrew challenged Oliver to a game of computer chess. She poured them both a glass of wine.
"You all set for tomorrow?"
Andrew asked, as Nicola handed him his glass. Nicola nodded. "You sure you don't mind taking us to the airport early tomorrow morning? I can order a taxi."
"Don't be silly, of course I'm taking you. Still wish I was going with you to France."
I explained this was something Oliver and I had to face alone, Nicola said, giving him a smile before he turned his attention back to the game on the computer. Later, after supper, and with Oliver in his room, Andrew pulled out the put-you-up and Nicola fetched the bedding. As they companionably made up the bed, Andrew glanced at her.
"It's going to be strange, living here for a week without you and Oliver being around."
He pushed a pillow into its case and threw it onto the bed.
"Years ago, when Mark asked me to keep an eye on you while he was away, make sure you were all right and coping, I was happy to do so," he said, hesitating. "I didn't realise how much I would come to care for you both. Now Mark's no longer with us, I was wondering whether you could ever see me as anything other than a good friend." Nicola's heart sank. Damn! Leaving things until she was back from France was clearly no longer an option. She concentrated on shaking the duvet into position for a moment, before looking directly at Andrew and smiling. You're the big brother I never had, as well as my best friend. I honestly don't know how I'd have got through the past months, years, without your help. Did her gentle words convey enough meaning for him to realise the truth? That there could never be more than a good friendship between them. She took a deep breath. They do say men and women can never truly have a platonic friendship, but you and I are the example that breaks the rule, aren't we? As the silence between them deepened, she realised Andrew was struggling to contain his words. He looked at her sadly for several seconds before taking a deep breath and giving a resigned nod. You'd better get to bed and get some sleep. You and Oliver have a long day tomorrow. Nicola swallowed a sigh of relief. Hopefully, Andrew had accepted her decision and a crisis in their friendship had been averted. When they returned from France, she'd make a determined effort to step back a little and try to keep their friendship on the even, platonic keel it had always been for her. Andrew was a good, kind man, and there was no way she wanted to hurt him. But she had to somehow make sure that he realised that he would never replace Mark in her affections. She wasn't sure there was anybody who could do that, even after the way Mark had treated her. Chapter 6. As the plane swooped down low over the Mediterranean on its approach to land at Nice Côte d'Azur airport, Nicola caught her breath. She'd forgotten how scary the landing was here, with the sea in such close proximity to the runway. The 2-hour flight from Bristol had passed pleasantly enough. Oliver, once he'd got over the excitement of takeoff, had plugged his earphones in and listened to his music, while she read the in-flight magazine in an effort to keep her mind off the forthcoming meeting with Henri. This visit, however difficult it proved to be, was a way of giving both herself and Oliver closure over the death of the man they'd both loved and lost. Finding closure and moving on after the loss of a loved one was hard enough, Nicola knew from bitter experience. But without a funeral, and that final chance to say goodbye to Mark, accepting his demise was proving to be harder than Nicola had anticipated. It was also a chance for Oliver to get to know his grandfather and his great-aunts, to give him the opportunity to try to build some sort of relationship with them. Whatever happened during the course of the next few days, she must remember she was here purely for Oliver's sake. She was determined to be civil to Henri at all costs and put all feelings of resentment about the way Henri had treated Mark and her over the years out of her mind. It wasn't until they were waiting for their luggage to show up on the baggage carousel that Nicola began to worry about the journey from Nice out into the back country. Stupidly, she'd been so concerned with actually getting them to France that she'd forgotten La Prouveresse was an hour's car drive inland from Nice. She could only hope that Henri, knowing the time their flight arrived, would be there to meet them, even if that would mean a difficult journey back to the farm. If Henri hadn't